The cattle were gone. Not scattered, not strayed, not spooked into the next valley where a good dog and a patient hand might round them up by morning. Gone. All 432 head of prime longhorn that Arthur Wells had spent 11 years building from a scraggly starting herd of 18 mangy calves. Gone into the churning brown madness of the Cimarron River during a flash flood that had no right to arrive in late September. A flood that the sky had given no honest warning about, and that the earth had swallowed whole before Arthur could do anything except stand on a crumbling bank and watch his entire life disappear downstream in a roiling wall of water and mud. He stood at the door of the Hartwell Waystation with his hat in his hands, which was not a gesture of courtesy. He was holding his hat because his hands needed something to do that was not shaking visibly in front of a stranger. His boots were still wet. His coat was torn at the left shoulder where a fence post had caught him when the bank gave out. There was dried blood along his jaw from a cut he had not felt until 3 hours after it happened, and he could not have told anyone whether the moisture on his face came from river water or something else he refused to name. He had ridden through the night. 22 miles from the crossing to the Waystation, alone, because his 2 drovers, Pete Sallow and young Cord, had turned back for Dodge City, the moment the last animal was confirmed lost. They had a right to. He had paid them for a drive and the drive was finished, just not in any manner any of them had planned. He knocked on the door of the Waystation because it was the only door within 22 miles and because something in him, some last stubborn animal instinct, understood that he could not sleep in the open again tonight. The woman who opened the door was not what he expected. He had expected old Harlan Teal, who had run the Hartwell station for the last decade and who smelled permanently of pipe tobacco and gave travelers stale biscuits without apology. What he got instead was a woman of perhaps 26 or 27, dark-haired, with steady brown eyes that took him in from head to boot, without a flicker of alarm or pity or the particular soft horror that most people offered a ruined man. She simply looked at him with an expression that was entirely neutral and said, "Come inside. You look like the river tried to keep you." He had no clever answer for that. He stepped inside. Her name was Minnie Chandler. He would not learn that for another 20 minutes, when he had been seated at the long oak table and given coffee that was real and hot and not watered down, and when the initial animal shock of warmth and shelter had begun to wear away at the edges of his numbness. She did not ask him questions. She moved around the station's main room with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been managing a space alone for long enough that she had stopped noticing the work of it. And she put a plate of beans and salt pork in front of him without ceremony or the particular loaded kindness that would have required him to perform gratitude he did not currently have the reserves for. It was that absence of performance that finally broke something loose in his chest. "I had 432 head," he said. He had not intended to say it. It came out of him the way the river had come down the canyon without warning and all at once. "Prime longhorns. I had contracts in Abilene. I had a buyer who'd been holding space for 2 years waiting on my herd. I had 11 years of my life in those animals." Minnie Chandler set down the coffee pot. She sat across from him at the table, not beside him, not at a safe and proper distance at the far end. Directly across, close enough that he could see the faint ink stain on her right index finger and the small scar at the corner of her left eyebrow. She folded her hands on the table and looked at him. She did not say she was sorry. She did not say the Lord works in mysterious ways, which was what the preacher in Caldwell had told him when his first wife, Clara, had died 4 years ago of a fever that took her in 11 days. She did not say he would rebuild or that things could have been worse or any of the other true and useless things people said to men who had lost everything. She said, "Tell me about them. The herd." He stared at her. "The cattle," she said, without any self-consciousness at all. "Tell me which one you're going to miss most." And God help him, Arthur Wells, who had not cried when Clara died because he had been too afraid and too proud and too much a product of the Kansas plains to allow himself the release. Arthur Wells put his face in his hands at a stranger's table in a Waystation on the Cimarron and said, in a voice that was barely held together, "There was a red roan cow I called Patience. She'd been with me since the beginning. She was the first calf born on my land. She knew my voice." And Minnie Chandler said nothing at all, which was exactly right. Let us go back. Let us go back to the beginning of it, to understand how Arthur Wells arrived at that door, and how Minnie Chandler came to be behind it, and how the particular alchemy of two damaged, private, deeply honest people could produce something as unlikely as love in the wreckage of the worst autumn either of them had ever lived. Arthur Wells was 32 years old in the fall of 1878. He had been born in Ohio, but had come west at 18 with his father and two older brothers after the family farm failed. And the West had kept all three of the Wells boys and killed their father within 6 months of arrival. A rattlesnake bite that turned septic before they could get him to a doctor in Wichita. Arthur had buried his father, watched his brothers head north to Wyoming for the cattle ranges there, and stayed in Kansas because he was too young and too stubborn to understand that staying was the hard choice. He had worked other men's ranches for 4 years before he had enough saved to lease grazing land outside Caldwell, and another 3 years before the lease became a purchase, and the 18 mangy calves became a respectable herd. He had married Clara Beach in the spring of 1873, and she had made their 2-room house into something that felt like a home. And when she died of fever in 1874, that home became a place he slept and ate and did not look at too carefully. He had kept working. He had kept building the herd because the herd was the one thing he could control, the one living system that responded honestly to care and effort, that did not die of fevers or leave without warning. He was not a complicated man, but he was not a simple one. He read when he could get books. He wrote letters to his brothers in Wyoming that he did not always send. He was known in Caldwell as a man of his word, a man who paid his debts on time and did not drink to excess and did not cheat at cards, which in Caldwell passed for virtue. The drive to Abilene in the fall of 1878 was supposed to be his vindication. The herd was large enough and healthy enough to command premium prices. He had a contract with a buyer named Elias Drummond, who had been following the growth of Arthur's herd for 2 years through letters and through a cattle broker named Silas Frey. The contract was for 400 head at $4.20 per head, which was better than the market average, and which would have given Arthur enough capital to expand his grazing land and finally put up a proper barn, and perhaps, in some corner of his mind, he did not examine too closely, to consider whether a solitary life was the life he actually wanted. He had hired Pete Sallow and young Cord Danner and set out in early September, which was reasonable timing for the late market. The drive north through Kansas was uneventful for the first 3 weeks. The weather held. The herd was manageable. Pete Sallow was experienced and Cord Danner was young but willing, and Arthur rode point and felt, for the first time in 4 years, like a man who was moving toward something rather than simply enduring. The Cimarron crossing was the last major obstacle before the final push to Abilene. Arthur had crossed it 4 times in previous years, always in summer when the water was low and predictable. He had never crossed it in late September after a week of heavy rain in Colorado that he had no way of knowing about, rain that had been draining into the river system for days, building pressure in 100 dry arroyos and creek beds north of the Kansas line. The crossing looked normal when they arrived. The water was moving faster than he liked, but it was still 4 double, and he had crossed in worse conditions. He put the lead steers in first, and the herd followed the way a trained herd will, trusting the instinct of the animals in front. The wall of water came from the northwest. It was not a wall exactly. That word implies too much drama and not enough randomness. It was a surge, A 3-foot rise in the river level that happened in the span of 4 minutes, the accumulated rainfall of an entire Colorado mountain range arriving all at once through a canyon that funneled it straight into the Cimarron crossing. The lead steers went under first. Then the herd panicked, as herds do, and the panic was worse than the water. Animals turned back against animals, knocked each other down, went into the current sideways, and were taken. Pete Sallow made it out on his horse. Cord Danner made it out. Arthur made it out only because his horse, a gray gelding named Colonel, was a powerful swimmer and a level-headed animal, and because a cottonwood branch swept Arthur off Colonel's back and into the bank, which broke 2 of his ribs but delivered him to solid ground. He lay on the bank and watched 432 head of longhorn cattle disappear downstream. The sound they made was something he would hear in his sleep for years, a rolling, terrified sound that was neither mooing nor screaming, but something between the two, the sound of animals that did not understand what was happening to them. When it was over, there was silence, and then the river diminished now, running copper-brown with Kansas mud, going about its business as if nothing had happened at all. Pete Sallow looked at him across the ruined bank and said, in the kind voice of a man who knows there are no kind words, "Mr. Wells, I'm sorry." And then Pete and Cord rode for Dodge City, which was the nearest large town and the sensible direction, and Arthur sat on the bank with his broken ribs and his soaked clothes and his living horse, and looked at the river for a long time. The decision to ride for the Hartwell Waystation was not a decision exactly. It was what his body did when he finally stood up and got back on Colonel, because Hartwell was the only settlement within reach, and the night was coming in October on the Kansas plains. Without shelter was not survivable in wet clothing with broken ribs. He rode. The miles were bad. The ribs made every step of Colonel's a small specific fire in his left side. He rode with his teeth set and his eyes on the horizon, and he did not think about anything, which was a skill he had developed in the year after Clara died, the ability to make his mind go perfectly flat and empty, like a salt flat in drought. He arrived at the Hartwell Waystation at approximately 11 o'clock at night. And Minnie Chandler opened the door. Now, about Minnie Chandler. She had come to the Hartwell Waystation in April of 1878, 6 months before Arthur Wells arrived at her door. She had not come there looking for purpose or adventure or any of the other things that newspapers back east attributed to women who went west. She had come because she had nowhere else to go, and because Harlan Teal, who was her mother's second cousin by marriage, had written to her that he needed help running the station and could offer her room and board and a small wage. Her situation, as she described it to no one who did not need to know it, was this. She had been engaged to a man in St. Louis named Gerald Voss, a merchant's son with pleasant manners and a hidden nature that revealed itself over 2 years of engagement as controlling, dishonest, and ultimately violent. She had ended the engagement in February of 1878, and he had responded by telling everyone in their shared social circle a version of events that cast her as the villain, which in St. Louis in 1878 effectively ended her social and professional life simultaneously, since the two were not really separable for a woman of her station. She was not a woman who dramatized her dark past. She had walked into that situation with open eyes. She had stayed longer than she should have because she had told herself the story that all people in bad situations tell themselves, the story of eventual change and eventual goodness. And when she had finally recognized the story for what it was, she had ended it cleanly. She was not ashamed. She was, however, entirely without resources, since her father was dead and her mother had remarried a man who was kind but not wealthy and who had 4 children of his own, and a 26-year-old former fiancé with a damaged reputation was not a comfortable addition to any household. Harlan Teal's letter had arrived in March like a window opening in a shut room. She had taken the train to Kansas City, the stage to Wichita, and the final 30 miles to Hartwell in the wagon of a farmer named Stubbs, who was going that direction anyway, and who talked the entire way about his corn prices without once asking her anything about herself, which she found, at that moment in her life, to be the most restful conversation she had ever had. Harlan Teal was 63 and arthritic and genuinely grateful. The Waystation needed a great deal of work that his hands could no longer manage, and Minnie was efficient, organized, and not afraid of labor. She cleaned the place out, reorganized the supply system, learned to manage the horses in the station's small stable, and within 2 months had the Hartwell Waystation running more smoothly than it had in a decade. In June, Harlan Teal had a stroke. It was mild, but it left his left side weakened and his speech occasionally tangled, and his nephew in Topeka wrote to say he was coming to take Harlan back with him to be cared for properly. Harlan had left Minnie enough money to cover 3 months of operating the station on her own, and had written, in his tangled post-stroke hand, a letter to the stage line company explaining that she was capable of continuing operations. The stage line had sent an inspector in July who had looked at her operation and looked at her, and made a face that she had learned to recognize. The face of a man encountering competence in a place he had expected to find inadequacy, and being unsettled by it. The inspector had gone away, and the stage line had continued to use the Waystation without ever formally approving her management, which was a bureaucratic ambiguity that suited her fine. She had been running the Hartwell Waystation alone for 4 months when Arthur Wells knocked on her door. She was not afraid of him, though he was a large man and he looked terrible, and he arrived at an hour that signaled disaster. She had been raised in a city, but she had spent 6 months on the Kansas plains, and the plains had an effect on a person's sense of threat. Real danger on the plains came quietly, from direction you weren't watching. A big man in a wet coat with blood on his jaw, knocking on a door he didn't have to knock on, was not danger. He was simply a man who needed help. The question of whether she pitied him or not was more complicated than it looked, and she had thought about it afterward, in the specific way that she turned things over in her mind late at night when the station was quiet. She had looked at him across the table while he told her about Patience the roan cow, and she had felt something that was very alert and very engaged, but that she would not have called pity. Pity required a kind of distance, a removal of oneself from the other person's experience in order to look at it from above. What she felt was more lateral than that. It was something closer to recognition. She too knew what it meant to build something slowly, and then watch it come apart faster than it had any right to. She sat with him while he finished his plate. He ate eventually, not quickly but steadily, the way a man eats when his body has reasserted its authority over his mind's desire to simply stop. When he pushed the plate aside, he looked up at her, and something in his expression had shifted. Some acute shame had settled into something quieter. "I don't know why I told you that," he said. "About the cow." "Because I asked," she said. "Most people don't ask. Most people are afraid of what they'll have to do with the answer." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not quite categorize, and then he looked at the table. "My name is Arthur Wells. I have a ranch outside Caldwell, or I did. I'm not certain what I have now." "You still have the ranch," she said. "The land doesn't go anywhere. The mortgage on the land is serviced by cattle sales," he said flatly. "Without the sale, I'm going to have difficulty by spring." She did not offer him false reassurance, and he noticed it and seemed to relax slightly, as if false reassurance had been what he was bracing against. "There's a cot in the back room," she said. "You're welcome to it. You're in no condition to ride tonight." He stood carefully, and she could see by the way he moved that something was hurt, something serious. "Your ribs," she said. "Some of them," he agreed. "Do you need them wrapped?" He paused, and she could see the particular male arithmetic happening, the calculation between need and pride, the weighing of pain against the vulnerability of accepting help from a woman he had known for 40 minutes. "Yes," he said, which told her something about him. that he was a man capable of overriding his pride when the practical need was clear enough. She wrapped his ribs with strips of clean cotton cloth from the station's supply, and his face during this process was entirely still, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on the far wall, but his breathing changed in small increments as the support took hold, the slight involuntary easing of a man in less pain than he had been in. He said, "Thank you," and meant it. She showed him the cot. She went back to her own room and lay in the dark and thought about a man who had lost everything and had not asked for pity and had accepted practical help without performing gratitude. She thought about the way he had said the name patience, with a specific softness that she suspected he almost never allowed himself in any other context. She did not sleep immediately. In the morning he was up before her, which she discovered when she came into the main room to find that someone had fed and watered all the horses in the stable, a task she normally did at dawn. He was at the table with a cup of coffee he had made himself, looking out the window at the flat October landscape, and he turned when she came in with an expression that was oddly calm for a man who had lost everything 12 hours ago. "The horses needed doing," he said. "I hope that was all right." "It was," she said. She poured her own coffee and sat across from him again, and the morning light was different from the night light, cleaner and more honest, and she looked at him in it. He was a good-looking man in a plain way, long-boned and square-jawed, with dark circles under gray eyes and a jaw that needed shaving, but that suggested a face worth looking at when it was rested. He was not what she would have called a handsome man in the St. Louis sense, the decorative sense. He was the other kind, the kind that became more interesting the longer you looked. "What are you going to do?" she asked, not gently, directly. He wrapped both hands around his mug. "Ride back to Caldwell, talk to the bank. I have a note with Henderson's bank and I need to know where I stand before I can plan anything." He paused. "The buyer, Drummond in Abilene. I'll need to send word that I've defaulted on delivery. He'll have to know quickly enough to make other arrangements." "Do you have proof of the flooding?" she asked. "Witnesses? Pete Sallow and Cord Danner." He said the names with a slight tightening around his eyes that told her those names had become complicated. They rode for Dodge City. They were there, they saw it. A man named Drummond might argue force majeure in any case, though whether the contract has such language I'd need to check. "You read your contracts," she observed. "I read everything," he said. She decided in that moment, sitting in the morning light with a man who read everything and fed horses out of some fundamental decency that did not require an audience, that she was going to do something sensible. She was going to keep things exactly as they were. He would ride back to Caldwell. She would continue to run the station. The world would proceed. This resolution lasted until he stood up to go and winced so sharply at the movement that he had to grip the table edge. "Your ribs," she said. "I know," he said. "I'll manage." "You can't ride 22 miles with broken ribs today," she said. "I've ridden further in worse condition." "That doesn't make it sensible." She looked at him evenly. "The stage comes through day after tomorrow. It goes to Wichita. You could send your messages from Wichita." He looked at her for a long moment, and she could see him doing the arithmetic again, the calculation between the urgency he felt and the practical truth of what his body could sustain. 2 days, he said. 2 days, she agreed. The 2 days became something she had not expected, which was a revelation. Not a dramatic one, not the kind that arrived in a single blinding instant. The slow kind, the kind that assembled itself from small things, from 2 days of shared meals and a shared table and shared labor, because he was not a man who could be idle, and on the second morning she found him repairing the station's water trough, which had been cracked and leaking for 2 months. "You don't have to do that," she said. "The trough is cracked," he said simply. "I can fix it." He fixed it. He also mended the latch on the stable door, which had been unreliable since August, and without being asked, split a considerable amount of the winter wood that she had been meaning to get to but hadn't. He worked steadily, and without the performance of industry, without the particular male display that she recognized from Gerald Voss, who had occasionally done household tasks with a theatrical bustle that required her to notice and praise the effort. Arthur Wells worked the way he had fed the horses because the thing needed doing. They talked while he worked. Not constantly. There were long, easy silences that she found surprising, because silence between strangers usually carried a charge of discomfort, but the silence between them was different. It was the silence of people who were comfortable with the interior lives of their own minds and did not feel obligated to fill space. When they did talk, it was honest and digressive and often funny, because he had a dry wit that she had not expected, and that appeared without warning, a sudden understated observation that made her laugh before she was braced for it. He told her about his brothers in Wyoming. She told him with more frankness than she had intended about Gerald Voss, not the whole of it, but enough. He listened without comment until she finished, and then said, "The man sounds like a coward," with such matter-of-fact certainty that she had to look away briefly so he would not see that it mattered to her to hear it. "Most people," she said, "thought I was the one who had behaved badly." "Most people," he said, driving a nail with the kind of precision that came from long practice, "don't know what they're looking at." On the second evening, the stage came through a day early due to a schedule change the driver mentioned without apology, and Arthur Wells stood in the station doorway with his hat in his hands again, but this time the hat in hands meant something different. She knew that now. "The stage'll go to Wichita," the driver said. "Got room for a passenger if you're heading that way." Arthur looked at Minnie. She looked back at him, and the look was not guarded and it was not performed. It was simply two people acknowledging something that had not been named. "I'll be back through," he said. "On my way south to Caldwell. Would you be willing to have me stop?" "Station is open to travelers," she said, which was not exactly the answer to the question he had asked, and they both knew it, and there was the ghost of something in the corners of his expression that might have been the beginning of a smile. "Miss Chandler," he said. "Mr. Wells," she said. He got on the stage. She stood in the doorway and watched it go, and the Kansas sky above the plains was enormous and cold and pale blue, and she breathed out very slowly into the October air. He was back in 12 days. Those 12 days were a complete and terrible education in what she had managed to avoid thinking about during the 2 days he had been present. She was efficient and organized, and she maintained the station and served the travelers who passed through and did all the things she always did, but the station's main room felt different. It felt larger. Not empty exactly. She was not a woman who relied on other people's presence to feel anchored, but larger, as if some dimension of the room had only become apparent when there was someone in it who occupied space in the particular way he did. She caught herself, more than once, thinking about things she wanted to tell him. A traveler had come through on the 4th day with news of a range dispute in the Panhandle that would have interested him. On the 7th day she had found a book in Harlan Teal's old chest, a technical manual on cattle breeding practices, and her first thought had been that Arthur Wells would find it useful. She left the book on the table rather than putting it away, and each morning she looked at it and thought about what she was doing. She knew what she was doing. She also knew that a woman in her situation had to be careful about the difference between what she wanted and what was wise. She was 26 years old, alone, running a Waystation on a provisional basis, with no legal claim on the property and no formal employment contract. Arthur Wells was a man who had just lost everything, who was heading into a confrontation with his bank, who was negotiating between what he had built and what the river had taken. He was not in a position to be anyone's anchor, and she was not looking for one. She told herself this for 12 days, and it was true, and it did not change anything about the way the main room felt larger. He arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in a different coat, a good brown wool coat that he had clearly bought in Wichita, and with his ribs still wrapped, she could see the outline of the binding at his waist when he dismounted. He tied Colonel to the post and came to the door and knocked, which she found both unnecessary and oddly touching. She opened the door. "Mr. Wells," she said. "Miss Chandler, He looked at her with those gray eyes that were less exhausted than they had been but still careful, still watchful. I said I'd stop. You did, she said. He came inside and sat at the table, and she put coffee in front of him and sat across, and it was so exactly like the first time that she felt a slight disorientation, as if the 12 days in between had been a very long, vivid dream. The bank, he said. Henderson at the bank was, not generous exactly, but fair. I have until March to make the first payment. If I can put together a smaller drive by next spring, 20 head of young stock I still have on the range, a few purchases, I might be able to service the note. Can you? She asked. Possibly, he said. He did not inflate it. He did not perform optimism. The buyer, Drummond, was understanding. The flood was documented. There were other ranchers who lost stock at the same crossing. It was a known event by the time I got to Abilene. He's holding the contract for spring delivery at the same price, fewer head. It's not what I had, but it's something. That's a good outcome, she said. It could be worse, he agreed. He looked down at his coffee and then back at her. I went by the land office while I was in Wichita. They have this station listed as a potential lease holding. Did you know that? She frowned. No, it's under the stage lines agreement. The stage lines agreement expired in August, he said. He said it carefully, not with any agenda she could detect, simply as fact delivered because he thought she should know it. The stage line hasn't renewed. The land office has it marked for review. Minnie sat very still. That was a thing she had not known, and it was a thing that mattered considerably. How long until review? The clerk said February, he said. If no one makes a claim before February, it goes back to open land office listing. Can I file a claim? She asked. A woman can file a homestead claim in Kansas, he said. The Homestead Act doesn't exclude women who are heads of household. Whether the station's particular land parcel is eligible under homestead versus lease, I'm not certain. You'd need a lawyer. She was quiet for a moment, reorganizing the information. It was characteristic of the panic she did not show that she simply sat still and reorganized. There's a lawyer in Caldwell, she said. Two, he said. One of them, Marcus Webb, is honest. The other one is not. Marcus Webb, she repeated. I'll write you a letter of introduction, he said. He'll see you promptly if he knows I sent you. She looked at him. There was something she wanted to say, and she was constructing how to say it. Why are you doing this? He met her eyes without flinching. Because the land office clerk told me without any enthusiasm, and if I had been a man in your situation, I'd want someone to tell me with some urgency. He paused, and because I was in a position to find out. That's a very practical answer, she said. I'm a practical man, he said. There was a silence that was not the easy kind, or not only the easy kind. It was the kind that carries weight. Mr. Wells, she said. Arthur, he said, if it's agreeable. Arthur, she said, and the word had a different texture in her mouth than Mr. Wells had. What you're doing is kind. I want you to know that I see it. He looked slightly uncomfortable with this, which she had expected. He picked up his coffee mug and put it down again. I didn't come back only about the land office, he said. He said it to the table rather than to her, which was the most unguarded thing she had seen him do. I want to be honest with you about that. The honesty of it, the plain, undecorated honesty, went through her like river water. I know, she said quietly. He looked up. You do. I'm not a woman who misses things, she said. No, he said slowly. I can see that. He was quiet. I'm not in a position to offer you much. I want you to know I'm aware of that. I have a ranch with a mortgage and broken ribs and no herd and a spring drive that may or may not save me. I'm not asking you for anything. What are you doing then? She asked. I'm sitting in your Waystation, he said, drinking your coffee and trying to think of a reason to leave that is more compelling than a reason to stay. She felt something unlock in her chest, not romantically, not in the theatrical way that novels described. It was smaller than that and truer, a particular release of a tension she had been carrying for 6 months, maybe longer. The tension of being someone who had made herself entirely self-sufficient as a form of protection, and who had gradually confused protection with preference. Stay for supper, she said. He stayed for supper. He stayed to help with the evening horses. He did not stay the night. He was too careful of her reputation and too aware of his own financial precariousness to be anything other than scrupulously correct. But he came back on Thursday, and again the following Tuesday, and Caldwell was not that far from the Hartwell station, and Colonel was a strong horse. This rhythm of visiting established itself through October and into November with the organic logic of two people who were both too private and too honest for games. They wrote letters between visits, and the letters were like the silences, easy and substantive, full of the particular kinds of things people write when they trust the reader. He told her about the spring drive planning. She told him about her progress with Marcus Webb the lawyer, who had been, as Arthur predicted, helpful and efficient. The homestead claim was complicated by the existing stage line agreement but not impossible. There was a legal mechanism that Webb was pursuing that involved documenting the expired agreement and the stage line's failure to renew. In one letter he wrote, "I find myself talking to you in my head when I am working, which is a new experience for me and not an entirely comfortable one, though I am coming to believe that most things worth having are not comfortable initially." She read this letter 3 times. Then she wrote back, "I find the same. I have been less lonely since August, which is the most honest thing I have said in a long time." He came in late November with his hat in his hands and no particular excuse for the visit, and stood in her doorway and looked at her with those gray eyes that had stopped being guarded somewhere around the 5th visit and were now simply direct, and said, "Miss Chandler, Minnie, I need to say something plainly." "Then say it," she said. "I am in love with you," he said. He said it without decoration or preamble or the elaborate scaffolding of approaching sentiment, the way he had said everything, directly and slightly to one side of formal. "I know my circumstances are not what a woman should have to navigate. I know I may lose the ranch by spring. I know I am asking you to consider a situation that is genuinely uncertain. I'm not going to pretend it isn't. But I am in love with you, and I wanted you to know it because I respect you too much to manage that information strategically." She stood in the doorway, and the cold November air came in around them, and she felt something that was not the romance novel feeling she had vaguely expected love to feel like when she had been 20 and naive and reading novels in St. Louis. It was not a swooning or a floating feeling. It was exactly the opposite. It was the feeling of weight, good weight, the feeling of something real and solid settling into place, the way a cornerstone settles. "Arthur Wells," she said, "you are the most direct man I have ever met." "I know it's a flaw sometimes," he said. "I have never found it a flaw," she said. She stepped back from the door and let him in, and the gesture was more than it looked like. "Come inside." He came inside. He sat at the table. She sat across from him, and she looked at him for a moment in the same frank way she had looked at him on the very first night, before she knew his name, and she said, "I am not in a safe situation myself. The station may not be mine by spring either. I have a small amount of savings and very little beyond that. I am not what I would call a sensible choice either." "I'm not looking for a sensible choice," he said quietly. "Neither am I," she said. "I am in love with you too. I want to say it just as plainly." He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached across the table carefully and put his hand over hers, and his hand was large and rough and warm, and she did not pull away. They sat like that in the November afternoon light, with the stove ticking and the wind coming off the plains, and it was one of the quietest and most absolute moments of her life. December came in cold and honest. Arthur drove out from Caldwell with regularity that had shifted from visits to something more frankly necessary, and Minnie was no longer pretending that his absence between visits was simply a logistical condition. They were people in love with each other, and managing it with a carefulness that came from both of them having been burned before, him by loss, her by a man who had turned out to be a trap she had not seen clearly enough from the inside. The spring drive planning was a source of genuine shared engagement. He talked through it with her the way he talked through everything, practically and thoroughly, and she found that she had instincts about it that came from 6 months of listening to dozens of men pass through the station, drovers and buyers and ranch hands, the accumulated market knowledge of a waystation on a main route. She told him things she had heard about prices and trail conditions and the movements of buyers, and he listened with the same quality of attention he gave everything she said, the attention of a person who believed what they were hearing was worth their full intelligence. In mid-December, the stage line sent a representative to the Hartwell station. He was a man named Horace Cow, small and precise, with a notebook and an air of official regret, and he told Minnie that the stage line had decided not to renew its use of the Hartwell station, as they were rerouting their southern line through Meade beginning in January, which was a route that did not pass through Hartwell. He was perfectly civil about it. He offered her 1 month's operating fee as a courtesy payment. He told her she could remain in the station through January while she made arrangements. When he left, she sat at the table for 20 minutes and then she wrote Arthur a letter and sent it with a rider who was heading south. Arthur arrived 2 days later. He came in and she told him everything and he listened and his jaw was set but his eyes were very steady. "Webb," he said. "Webb says the homestead claim can still be filed but it may take months to resolve," she said. "In the meantime, the property will revert to open listing." He was quiet. Then he said, "Come to Caldwell." She looked at him. "I know," he said. "I know what I'm asking and I know how it looks. I'm not asking you to come to Caldwell in any way that compromises your reputation or your independence. I am asking," he said, with the deliberateness of a man choosing every word, "if you would be willing to marry me. If you would be willing to let your situation and my situation be one situation." She had known it was coming. She had known in the way one knows a season is coming, not the exact day but the certainty. She sat with it for a moment, not because she was uncertain but because she wanted to be honest with herself about why she was saying yes, to be sure it was not because she had nowhere else to go, to be sure it was not the trap of Gerald Voss in a different costume, the need disguising itself as love. And she looked at Arthur Wells across the table, and she asked herself those questions with full clarity, and the answers came back clean. She loved him because he was himself. Because he was direct and decent and capable of overriding his pride when the practical need required it. Because he had said the name of a dead cow with tenderness. Because he had told her about the land office record when he had no obligation to, when he could simply have ridden back to Caldwell and thought of her occasionally and let her lose the station without knowing it was preventable. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He was quiet for 3 full seconds. Then he said, "All right," with a relief and a warmth in his voice that he did not entirely manage to contain, and she was glad of it. They married in January of 1879, in the courthouse in Caldwell, with Marcus Webb as witness and Pete Sallow, who had come back for reasons he explained, as owing Mr. Wells a fair accounting of the crossing, also present. The ceremony was brief and legal, and when the judge pronounced them married, Arthur looked at her sideways with a slight crinkling at the corners of his eyes that was his version of joy, and she returned it with a directness that made Pete Sallow look at the ceiling. The ranch outside Caldwell was a 2-room house and a barn in progress and grazing land that currently held 23 head of young stock that Arthur had gathered from his remaining animals and 2 careful purchases. It was exactly what it was, nothing more. She walked through it on the day she arrived and looked at everything without pretense, and then she said, "The kitchen window faces south. That's good for the morning." Arthur stood in the doorway and watched her move through his house, and she was aware of him watching but not self-conscious about it, and the house did not feel the way Caldwell had felt to her when he had ridden away from it toward Abilene in September. It did not feel like a place where someone had once been at home. It felt like a place that was waiting to learn what home was. She made it home. Not sentimentally, not in a domestic performance of wifely function, but in the practical way she made everything, with organization and efficiency and a thoroughness that extended to knowing where everything was and why it was there. She hung her things. She rearranged the kitchen because the arrangement made no sense, and told Arthur so, and he said, "Fair enough," and helped her move the shelves. The spring came with a ferocity that Kansas springs always had, as if compensating for the long cold. Arthur put together a drive of 87 head by April, a miracle of careful purchasing and neighbor goodwill, 2 ranchers in the county having lent him young stock on a profit-sharing agreement when they heard the terms he was offering. 87 was not 432, but Drummond's contract was for a minimum of 60, and Arthur had 87. Pete Sallow came back for the drive. He brought Cord Danner, who had wintered in Dodge City, and who had grown 3 inches emotionally since the Cimarron, by all appearances. Arthur hired 2 additional drovers, a weathered man named Briggs and a quiet Comanche man named Thomas C. Farr, who was one of the best horsemen Arthur had ever worked with, and who knew the trail north better than any map. Minnie stood at the yard gate on the morning they set out. Arthur rode Colonel, who was perfectly healthy and somewhat opinionated about the weather. He brought his horse alongside the gate and looked down at her. "I'll be back in 6 weeks," he said. "I know," she said. She put her hand up and he took it briefly, and his grip was steady and warm, and she held it for 2 seconds longer than she had planned. "The Cimarron," she said. "I know," he said. "We're crossing downstream of the September site. Thomas C. Farr says it's a better ford." "I'll be here," she said. "I know you will," he said, and something in the certainty of it, the way he said it without performance or excessive sentiment, was more reassuring than anything more elaborate could have been. The 6 weeks were the longest of Minnie's adult life, and she had lived through some long weeks. She ran the ranch in his absence with the same efficiency she had brought to the Waystation, managing the remaining stock, keeping the books, negotiating with a local merchant named Fairchild over feed prices, with a firmness that left Fairchild slightly startled. She wrote in the evenings, not letters to Arthur because he was on the trail, and letters did not catch trail drives, but in a small journal that Harlan Teal had left at the station, writing things she would tell Arthur when he came back. She wrote about a cow who had gotten her foot caught in the fence on the 15th day. She wrote about a thunderstorm that had come up from the southwest with the particular greenish light that she had learned to fear, and that had spent itself without a tornado. She wrote about the way the ranch looked in the morning, the way the grass had greened up so fast in April that you could almost watch it, and how the 23 remaining head of Arthur's original stock moved through it with the ease of animals that knew their ground. She wrote, on a page she folded over twice and then unfolded again, "I think he is going to be all right. I think we are going to be all right." This is not a thing I thought I would be able to say with confidence again, and I am saying it carefully, but I am saying it. The drive arrived in Abilene in late May. She knew this because Elias Drummond sent a telegram to the Caldwell Telegraph office on the day of delivery, addressed to her, which she thought was an extraordinary courtesy, and which made her understand something about why Arthur had held the contract with Drummond through everything. The telegram read, 87 head delivered, full contract price, WELLS on way home. She read it 3 times standing in the telegraph office, and the operator, a young man named Clark, watched her with the careful curiosity of someone who understood he was witnessing something he was not fully privy to. "Good news," he said. "Yes," she said, "good news." Arthur came home on a Tuesday in early June, thin and sunburned and riding a tired Colonel, and he looked at her across the yard with those gray eyes, and something in his face that she recognized as the inverse of what she had seen on the night he arrived at her door. Not devastation. The other thing. The thing that looks like devastation from a distance, but that is actually its opposite. He dismounted and came toward her, and she walked toward him, and when they met in the middle of the yard, she put her arms around him and felt him exhale for the first time since September. 87 head, she said, against his shoulder. Full price, he said. Enough to service the note, enough to buy back up to 60 head for fall. "I know," she said. "Drummond telegraphed." He pulled back enough to look at her. "He telegraphed you." "He did," she said. Something moved through his expression that was very close to a man who has discovered he is surrounded by more goodness than he had accounted for. "Good man," he said quietly about Drummond. "Come inside," she said. "I have supper and I want to read you some things I wrote." He stopped. "You kept a journal." "I did," she said. "Can I read it?" he asked, with a directness that was both characteristic and slightly touching. "I was going to read it to you," she said, "so you'd hear my voice in it." He looked at her for a moment, and the Caldwell June light was long and golden and made everything look like something worth keeping. "All right," he said, and his voice had the warmth in it again, the warmth he was better at containing than expressing, which made the expressions more valuable. "Then read it to me." She read him the journal that evening, all of it, including the page she had folded twice and unfolded. He listened with his whole self the way he always listened, and when she read the part about thinking they would be all right, he reached across and covered her hand with his, the way he had at the table in November, and they sat in the June evening with the door open and the cattle somewhere in the dark pasture making their peaceful sounds. "I want to rebuild the herd properly over the next 3 years," he said. "I have a plan. I want to talk it through with you, all of it." "Tomorrow," she said. "Tomorrow," he agreed. That summer and the summer after it were a kind of building that Minnie had not anticipated, not because she had been pessimistic, but because she had not known what it felt like to build something alongside someone else, to have her intelligence and her instincts genuinely incorporated into the making of something that was also hers. In St. Louis with Gerald Voss, she had been managed and shaped. At the Waystation alone, she had been fully herself but also fully alone. Here she was fully herself and also part of something larger, and the combination was a revelation that arrived not in a single moment, but in hundreds of small ones. She kept proper accounts for the ranch, in a double-entry ledger system she had read about in a business manual from Harlan Teal's chest, and her system was better than what Arthur had been doing, which he acknowledged without defensiveness. "Show me how that works," he said, and she showed him, and he learned it with the same focused attention he brought to everything. She planted a kitchen garden in the spring of 1880 and grew tomatoes and winter squash and enough sweet corn that they had more than they needed, and she traded the excess at the Caldwell market. The market trading led to relationships with other ranch wives in the area, women who were themselves capable and practical, and who had formed a loose network of mutual assistance that Minnie entered and found deeply congenial. These women, Hetty Briggs, whose husband was the same Briggs who had driven the spring cattle, and Sadie Renner, who ran the Renner homestead solo, while her husband was absent on Army contract work, and a Cheyenne woman named Mary Cloud who had married a white farmer named Elbert Cloud, and who was navigating a situation of considerable social complexity with remarkable grace. These women became important to her life in ways she had not expected to allow. She had been guarded about female friendships in St. Louis, where the women in her social circle had largely sided with Gerald Voss's version of events. But Hetty Briggs and Sadie Renner and Mary Cloud were not women who had the luxury of social games. They were women who needed actual allies, and Minnie was good at being one. Mary Cloud, particularly, became a close friend. Mary had come to Kansas from Colorado with her husband, and her situation was complicated by the hostility of some of their neighbors, who made their views on mixed marriages known through the particular frontier methods of exclusion and occasional vandalism. Minnie found this enraging in the specific way that injustice enrages a person who has been on the receiving end of a community's unjust version of events, and she made a point of including Mary in the market trading and the mutual assistance network in ways that were both practical and clearly intentional. Arthur, when she told him about it, said, "Elbert Cloud is a decent man, and Mary is clearly worth 10 of the people who have a problem with her," which was one of the things she loved about him, his utter lack of patience for social cruelty disguised as propriety. In the winter of 1879, Minnie discovered she was pregnant. She sat with this knowledge for a day before she told Arthur, not because she was afraid to tell him, but because she wanted to sit with it herself first, to feel the full shape of it before it became shared. When she told him, she said it directly, the way she said everything, and his response was to go very still for a moment, and then to stand up from the table and come around to her side and put both his hands on her face with a gentleness that she had not known he possessed, though in retrospect she should have, since a man who spoke of dead cattle with tenderness had tenderness to spare. He said, "Are you all right?" "I am," she said. "I'm very well." He was quiet for another moment, and then he said, with the careful understatement of a man managing a volume of feeling that exceeded his usual register, "This is a very good thing." Their son was born in August of 1880, in the heat of a Kansas summer, delivered by a midwife named Mrs. Polly, who had been attending births in the Caldwell area for 20 years, and who handled everything with an efficiency that Minnie deeply appreciated. The boy was large and pink and absolutely himself from the first moment, announcing his presence with a lung capacity that suggested strong opinions, and Arthur held him with the slightly stunned expression of a man confronting an entirely new category of experience and finding it much larger than his expectations. "He needs a name," Minnie said. "I know," Arthur said. He was looking at the baby in his arms with the same quality of attention he brought to everything that mattered. "What do you want?" "I want to hear what you think," she said. "James," he said. "My father's name." She looked at him. His father, buried in Kansas at 52, the one who had come west with his sons and not made it. She thought of the letter Arthur had told her about, the letter to his brothers in Wyoming that he did not always send. "James Wells," she said. "Yes, that's right." James Wells was a child of considerable personality from an early age, which should not have surprised either of his parents and somehow still did. He was mobile before most children his age, and verbal with an intensity that Minnie recognized and Arthur met with a patience that she found wonderful to observe. Arthur read to him from the first months, not children's books they did not have, but from whatever was available, newspapers, the cattle breeding manual from Harlan Teal's chest, a geography of the American West that Arthur had picked up in Wichita. The ranch grew. By 1882, Arthur had rebuilt the herd to 212 head, not the 432 of the fall of 1878, but a number he had reached with intention and method, selecting for animals that were healthy and well-conformed, and that would produce good calves. The drives north were smaller than the 78 Ambition, but they were consistent and profitable, and the pattern of them, the careful planning, the trail reading, the relationship with Drummond's buying operation in Abilene, had become something that Arthur understood in his bones in a way he could not have claimed before the disaster. He said this to Minnie one evening in the spring of 1882, sitting on the porch of the house, which was now 4 rooms and had a good stone chimney and a proper barn because they had done the work. He said, "I think I'm a better rancher than I was before the flood." She looked at him. "Why?" "Because I stopped thinking the herd was what I was building," he said. "I was building something else. The herd was the means of it, not the thing itself." She thought about this. "What were you building?" "I think I didn't know before," he said. "I know now." He did not explain this further, and he did not need to because she was sitting next to him on the porch with James asleep inside and the spring grass running out to the horizon under a sky that was every shade between blue and gold. She reached over and took his hand. He turned his hand over and held hers. They were quiet for a long time. In the fall of 1882, Minnie's mother, Eleanor, came from St. Louis to visit. It was the first time they had seen each other since Minnie had left, and the visit required a particular courage from both of them, the courage of 2 people who had loved each other through a difficult circumstance and who had not said everything they needed to say about it. Eleanor Haskell, which was her name now, her remarried name, was a small woman with Minnie's eyes and a bearing that suggested someone who had navigated a great deal and learned to do it quietly. She came off the stage in Caldwell and looked around at the Kansas fall, which was substantial, and said, "Well, this is real." "It is," Minnie said. Alina looked at her daughter for a long moment in the particular way that mothers look at daughters who have been out of reach, taking inventory. Then she said, "You look well. You look better than well." "I am," Minnie said. She looked at Arthur, who had come to meet the stage and who stood a respectful slight distance back with his hat in his hands. Alina looked at him with the frank assessment of a woman who had learned to look carefully. Arthur said, "Mrs. Haskell, welcome to Kansas." Alina said, "You must be Arthur." "Yes, ma'am." Alina made a slight sound that was not exactly a laugh but was something in that direction. "Minnie's letters," she said, "were quite thorough. I expected you to be real. You are." He looked slightly nonplussed, which was charming, Minnie thought, on a man who was usually very plussed. "Thank you," he said uncertainly. Alina's visit lasted 3 weeks. During those 3 weeks, Alina revised whatever story she had been carrying about Minnie's situation from the careful, factual letters Minnie had sent, and replaced it with the actual thing, the reality of the ranch and the house and James, who delighted Alina in the way grandchildren delight grandmothers from the first moment, and Arthur, whom Alina watched for the entire first week with the specific vigilance of a mother whose daughter had been hurt before, and who gradually, over the course of that week, visibly stood down from that vigilance. On the last evening, Alina sat with Minnie in the kitchen after Arthur had gone out to check the stock for the night, and she said, "He listens to you." "He does," Minnie said. "Not all men do," Alina said. This was not a statement about all men. It was a statement about Gerald Voss said sideways in the way that Alina had always spoken sideways about things that were difficult. "I know," Minnie said. "I was worried," Alina said, "when you left. I was worried about the reasons you left and about where you were going." "I know that too," Minnie said. Alina was quiet. Then she said, "I'm not worried now." This was the most complete thing her mother had said to her in years, and it settled something in Minnie's chest that she had not known was still unsettled. She walked her mother to the stage the next morning and they embraced, and Alina said quietly, "Come to St. Louis when you can, or I'll come back. Either way." And Minnie said, "Either way," and watched the stage go south. James Wells at 2.5 was a force of considerable local opinion. He had his father's gray eyes and his mother's directness, and a personality that was entirely his own, a combination of loud certainty and sudden deep thought that kept both his parents in a state of perpetual engaged attention. He had developed a particular fascination with the cattle, specifically with following Arthur on the morning rounds, which Arthur accommodated with a patience that Minnie watched from a careful distance and found deeply moving. She watched Arthur with James the way she watched everything that mattered, with her full attention and without sentimentality. He was a good father in the way he was a good everything, practically, thoroughly, and with genuine engagement. He taught James the names of things, real names, the names of grasses and weather conditions and the different qualities of cattle, not as lessons exactly, but as the natural extension of his own way of moving through the world, which was to pay attention. James called the roan cow Patience II, which was the name Arthur had given to a young red roan heifer he had purchased in the spring of 1880, a deliberate choice that Minnie had noticed and not commented on. James had arrived at the name independently, which told Minnie something about what Arthur had told him, and at what level of seriousness. In the winter of 1883, Pete Sallow came back to the ranch, this time not for a drive but with a proposition. He had spent the last several years managing a larger ranch operation in the Panhandle, and had connections with buyers in Kansas City who were looking for reliable small ranch suppliers. The network he described was the kind of arrangement that bypassed the individual long drive model in favor of pooled smaller drives to a rail depot, a system that was beginning to take hold as the railroads pushed further into Kansas. Arthur listened to the whole of it and said, "Let me talk to Minnie." Pete Sallow, who had known a great many ranchers, looked slightly surprised by this and then not, because he had also known Arthur Wells for 5 years, and Arthur Wells doing anything without full consultation of the person he considered his partner was not something that fitted the man's character. Minnie sat with the proposition for 2 days, turned it over, asked Arthur 4 questions about the specifics of the pooling arrangement, and said, "The risk is in the quality control across ranches. If Briggs or anyone else in the pool delivers poor stock, it affects the whole pool's reputation with the Kansas City buyers. I'd want that addressed contractually before you commit." Arthur wrote this to Pete Sallow. Pete Sallow wrote back that Minnie was entirely correct and that he had not thought of it in those terms and that he would revise the proposed terms accordingly. He also wrote in a postscript that Arthur read aloud to Minnie, "Mrs. Wells has a better head for livestock business than most men I've known. This is meant as a compliment." "It is one," Minnie said. "I know," Arthur said. The pooling arrangement was formalized in the spring of 1883, with 4 ranches in the Caldwell area, Arthur's, Briggs's, a newcomer named Porter whose family had come from Missouri, and a 4th rancher named Hawkins who raised mostly quarter horses but had a small cattle operation on the side. The arrangement worked, not smoothly in the first year. There were disputes about pooling percentages and quality standards that required renegotiation, but it worked. The Kansas City connection that Pete Sallow provided turned out to be reliable and to offer prices comparable to the Abilene market with significantly less trail exposure. By 1884, Arthur's herd stood at 280 head, and his note with Henderson's Bank was fully retired. The day he made the final payment, he came home and stood in the doorway of the kitchen where Minnie was writing in her account ledger and said, "The note is done." She put down her pen. She looked at him. He crossed the room and sat down across from her at the table, the same relative position they had occupied on the night she had said, "Come inside." And he had come inside, and everything had started to be something other than what it had been. And she looked at his face in the afternoon light of 1884, which was the same light that had been there in 1878 when she had opened the door to a ruined man and offered him beans and salt pork and an honest absence of pity. He was not a ruined man now. He was never going to be a wealthy man in the Abilene buyer sense, in the large landowner sense. But he was a man who had built something back from nothing, carefully and honestly, and who had done it with a partner who was entirely herself. And the ranch outside Caldwell was a real thing, a living thing, and the mortgage was retired. "Are you happy?" she asked him. He looked at her with the gray eyes that were no longer guarded in any way at all. He had stopped guarding them somewhere in the 2nd year of their marriage, stopped the careful watchfulness he had maintained for the 4 years after Clara died, and what was underneath the guardedness was what she had suspected all along, a man of very considerable feeling who had simply learned through loss to keep it where it wouldn't be a liability. "Yes," he said, "genuinely. I didn't expect to be." He paused. "I didn't think, after the crossing, after losing everything, I didn't think I'd find my way to this." "What is this?" she asked. "This," he said, and he gestured, not at the room exactly, but at everything the room contained and suggested and implied, the ledger with its careful entries, the sound of James in the yard outside with the dog, the smell of the stew on the stove, the late sun coming through the south-facing kitchen window she had noted on the first day. All of this is this." She smiled at him, and it was a particular smile, not bright exactly, not the performing smile she had worn in St. Louis. The smile she used now was smaller and truer, and it was the smile of a woman who had been, for a very long time, afraid that she had closed the wrong door when she left Gerald Voss behind, afraid that she had made herself too self-sufficient, too private, too thoroughly sealed against the particular vulnerability of needing someone. She had not closed the wrong door. She had walked through the dark between one door and another, and she had come out at a Waystation in October, at 11 o'clock at night, and she had opened the door to a man who arrived with neither artifice nor hope, and she had offered him exactly what she had, which was coffee and honesty and the absence of pity. And he had given her back everything. In 1885, Minnie was pregnant again. She handled the pregnancy with the same practical directness she brought to everything, continuing her work through most of it, though the summer heat was formidable, and she let Arthur do the outdoor rounds on the hottest days without argument. James was 5 and deeply interested in the proceedings, asking questions about the baby's progress with the same literal intensity he brought to everything. "Where is the baby sleeping?" James asked one morning. "In my stomach for now," Minnie said. James considered this. "Is there room?" "It's managing," she said. Arthur, who had been listening from across the room, made the slight eye-crinkling expression that was his version of laughter. The second child was born in October of 1885. 7 years almost to the day from the night Arthur Wells had knocked on a Waystation door with his hat in his hands. A girl this time, and the fact of the timing was not lost on Minnie, who noted it in her journal with a specific satisfaction. Arthur held the baby in the way he had held James, with the same stunned carefulness, and James stood on his tiptoes to look and said, "She's very small." "You were very small," Minnie said. "I don't think I was that small," James said, with the certainty of a 5-year-old. "You were," Arthur confirmed. "What's her name?" James asked. Arthur looked at Minnie. She looked at Arthur. This was a conversation they had had quietly in the weeks before, and she had come to the name the same way she came to most things, by thinking about it seriously and then saying what was true. "Clara," she said. Arthur's face did something complicated and then settled into something clear. Clara had been his first wife, the woman who had died of fever in 1874, and Minnie had thought carefully about this, about whether naming their daughter after her was the right thing, whether it was a gift to Arthur and a generous acknowledgement of a life that mattered, or whether it was a complication she should leave undisturbed. She had decided it was the right thing. Not because she was not occasionally aware of Clara's ghost in the house, in the small ways that a first love inhabits any space that came after it, but because she was not a woman who was afraid of ghosts, and because Arthur had loved Clara honestly and lost her honestly and had been trying to manage that loss alone for too many years. A name was not a competition. It was an acknowledgement. "Clara," Arthur said. His voice was steady but very quiet. "Clara Wells," Minnie said. "If that's right with you." "It's right," he said. James said, "Hello, Clara," to the baby with the patient politeness of a child who had been raised to take things seriously. Clara Wells turned out to be a very different creature from her brother. Where James was loud and certain and constantly in motion, Clara was observant and quiet, and made her opinions known through a precision of expression that caused people to find her slightly unnerving at the age of 2 and compelling by the age of 4. She had her father's gray eyes and her mother's bearing, and she attached herself to the cattle operations of the ranch from the earliest age. Not to the droving or the physical work, but to the watching, sitting on the fence rail with a quality of attention that made the older hands claim she could read a sick animal before any of them could. In 1887, the Wells Ranch formalized a partnership with the Porter and Briggs operations as a joint pooling operation, which was Minnie's idea, and which she had drafted on paper before presenting it to Arthur and the other families. The arrangement created a shared purchasing power for young stock and a shared contract with the Kansas City buyers that gave all 3 operations significantly better terms than any of them could negotiate individually. Marcus Webb, the lawyer who had helped with the homestead question back in the early days, drew up the partnership documents. He had become, over the years, something of a family advocate, and he looked at Minnie's draft with the slight elevation of eyebrows that she had learned to recognize as his version of impressed. "This is well constructed," he said. "Thank you," she said. "Did you have training in contract law?" he asked. "I had access to books and adequate patience," she said. The partnership, formalized in the spring of 1887, was the foundation on which the next decade of the Wells family's prosperity would be built. Not dramatic prosperity, not the prosperity of the big cattle barons whose names appeared in the newspapers, but the solid, unglamorous prosperity of people who built things carefully and maintained them, and did not overextend, and did not make promises they could not keep. Arthur, at 41, was a different man from the 32-year-old who had arrived at Minnie's door. He was still direct and still private and still the kind of man who noticed when a fence needed mending and mended it without commentary. But the particular strain of endurance that had held him together through Clara's death and the flood and the long solitary years was gone, replaced by something quieter and more expansive. He had stopped being a man braced for loss and become a man at home in what he had. Minnie, at 35, was exactly herself, which was perhaps the truest thing that could be said about her. She had not expanded into wife and mother as the sole definition of her identity, nor had she maintained the complete self-containment of the Waystation years. She had become something she had not entirely anticipated, a person who was both fully herself and genuinely part of something larger, and the combination was what she had not known in the February of 1878 when she had left St. Louis with a one-way ticket to Kansas City to hope for. In the late summer of 1887, a letter came from Thomas C's Farr, the Comanche man who had driven the spring cattle in 1879. He had been working various trail operations since then and had wound up in the Oklahoma Territory, which was a complicated place to be in 1887, as the pressures on the remaining tribal lands were accelerating toward the land rushes that everyone who paid attention knew were coming. Thomas's letter was practical and without self-pity, which Minnie recognized as the voice of a man of considerable dignity navigating indignity without granting it the power to define him. He was looking for work. He named Arthur Wells as a reference and said he was heading north in September if there was anything available. Arthur read the letter and passed it to Minnie. She read it and said, "Write back and tell him yes. We have the positions filled for the fall," Arthur said. "Then we'll have one more," she said. He looked at her, she looked at him. "Yes," he said. He wrote back and told Thomas C's Farr yes. Thomas C's Farr arrived in September of 1887 and stayed for 3 years, becoming one of the most valued hands the ranch had and teaching James Wells, who was 7 and then 8 and then 9 during those years, more about reading animal behavior and weather and trail conditions than any school book could have conveyed. Thomas was a quiet man who said what he meant and meant what he said, and he and Arthur understood each other with the economical efficiency of two people who shared a fundamental way of being in the world. When Thomas left in 1890, heading further north to Wyoming where work on the range was reliable, Arthur gave him a strong young horse and 2 months' wages in advance, which was more than the terms required. Thomas shook his hand and said, "Your children are good people." He nodded at Minnie. "Because of her and him," Minnie said. Thomas made a slight sound that acknowledged this without fully conceding it and rode north. The 1890s brought the Wells Ranch a slow and unglamorous stability that Minnie regarded with deep satisfaction. The Kansas cattle market had changed considerably from the long drive era of the 1870s. The railroads had transformed everything, and the partnership arrangement that Minnie had structured put the Wells operation in a reasonable position within the new landscape. They were not unaffected by the agricultural depressions of the decade, the price collapses and the droughts, but they were not destroyed by them either, because the operation had been built to weather difficulty, scaled conservatively, diversified enough that a bad cattle year was not a catastrophic one. James, at 12, was already doing the work of a full hand on the ranch. He was not forced into this. He wanted it. He had his father's focused relationship with physical work and his mother's analytical instinct, and he was developing into a person of considerable capability that both his parents watched with the specific satisfaction of people who had put everything they had into something and were seeing it take shape. Clara, at 7, was reading at a level several years above her age, and had developed an opinion about nearly everything that she expressed with a precision that made her teacher at the Caldwell School send a note home saying she was gifted, and also that she occasionally corrected his arithmetic. Minnie had gone to speak to the teacher and had explained, with measured clarity, that Clara's corrections were to be evaluated on their merits, and if they were correct she should be acknowledged as such. The teacher, a young man who was new to Caldwell, had said, "Yes, Mrs. Wells," with the expression of someone who had just understood what kind of household Clara Wells came from. In 1892, Arthur rode out to the far pasture on a November morning and came back by midday, which was earlier than expected, and Minnie knew from the quality of his return, the way he dismounted and handled Colonel, that something had happened. He came inside and sat at the table, the old familiar table, and said, "I found a spot in the east fence. The herd pushed through. About 40 head are into the Renner property." "How long?" she said. "Last night, I think," he said. "Sadie Renner's going to have trampled crops." He was already thinking about what he owed her for the damage. Minnie said, "Go and see Sadie. Take James. I'll send word to Briggs to come help with the roundup." He nodded. He stood. He looked at her for a moment with the expression she knew very well by now, the particular look that meant he was about to say something he was not going to say out loud, and she returned it with the expression that meant she knew. He went out. She went to the window and watched him, and the November light on the Kansas plains was the same light it had always been, enormous and cold and pale, and it fell on the ranch that had been built from nothing, and on the man she had married when she had nothing to offer but herself, which it turned out had been enough, and he had come to her with nothing but himself, which it had also turned out was enough. And the things they had built together from those two separate nothings were real and solid and alive, and stood in the morning light of 37 years of their accumulated lives. She was 39 years old, and she had the accounts to do, and a letter to write to her mother, and a partnership meeting with the Porters and the Briggs families on Thursday, and James was outside saddling his horse to go with his father to the Renner place, and Clara was at school learning things and correcting teachers and being exactly herself. Minnie Chandler Wells stood at the window of her kitchen and looked out at the plains and felt, with a fullness that left no room for anything else, how entirely right it all was. She sat down at the table and opened the ledger. Then she closed it again. She went to her desk in the small room that Arthur had built for her specifically, a room for her desk and her books and her journal and the partnership papers and everything else that needed her attention, because he was that kind of man, the kind who noticed what was needed and built it without being asked to. She opened her journal, the one she had started in Harlan Teal's old chest at the Waystation, long since filled and replaced with newer ones, though she still had the original on the shelf where she could see it. She opened the current one and wrote, because she had kept the habit all these years, the habit of writing things down so that she had them. She wrote, October 1892. 14 years from the night he knocked on the door. I have been thinking about what I knew then and what I know now, and the answer is that I knew very little then, only that he needed coffee and that he had lost something enormous, and that he was not going to pretend otherwise. I know now that those three things were a sufficient basis for everything that came after. Loss without pretense is the beginning of something real. I did not know that at 26. I know it at 39. The plains are beautiful this morning. She closed the journal. She heard, outside, the horses and James calling something to his father, and the particular morning sounds of the ranch going about its life. She opened the ledger. She did the accounts. They were good. They were not magnificent, but they were good, and good was the thing she had always trusted more than magnificent, because good was the thing that lasted. A year later, in the fall of 1893, Arthur came home from a supply trip to Caldwell with two things: a new bridle that he had been meaning to buy for months and a puppy, a brown and white cattle dog whose parent, a ranch collie with a notable reputation for working cattle, had produced a litter of 9. He brought the puppy inside in the crook of his arm and put it on the kitchen floor, and it immediately fell over its own feet, and then recovered and looked up at the assembled Wells family with enormous bright eyes. Clara said, "Oh," with a specificity of feeling that was unusual for her. James crouched down, and the puppy investigated him with the full commitment of a creature for whom every new thing was the most important thing. Arthur looked at Minnie. Minnie looked at the puppy and then at Arthur and shook her head slightly, which was not a no. "He needs a name," Arthur said, and the echo of it, the deliberate echo of what she had said about James at the beginning, was perfectly clear between them. She thought for a moment. She looked at the puppy, who was now investigating the leg of the table with great interest. She looked at Arthur. "Harlan," she said. For Harlan Teal, who had opened a window in a shut room with a letter sent to St. Louis in 1878. Arthur smiled. It was the full version of the smile, not the crinkling at the corners version, but the actual thing, and he looked younger in it, or not younger, better, the word was better. "Harlan it is," he said. Harlan the cattle dog became, in the years that followed, as integral to the functioning of the Wells ranch as any other member of the operation. He was exceptionally good at his job, as his mother's reputation had predicted, and he worked the cattle with a combination of intelligence and energy that Thomas C. Farr, had he still been there, would have recognized and approved. James Wells left for a year in 1896, at 16, to work with his Uncle Henry, Arthur's older brother, on the Wyoming ranch, which was a thing Arthur had arranged quietly with Henry through the letter correspondence that had continued through the years, and which was a gift to James of exactly the right kind. A year of working a different operation and seeing a different landscape before he came back to Kansas to continue what he had grown up knowing. He came back in 1897 taller and quieter, and with a range of Wyoming in his eyes that never entirely left, and Arthur shook his hand when he came home and said, "Good trip," and James said, "Very good," and that was enough. Clara, at 12, had already made known her intention to go to the women's college in Topeka when she was of age, an intention that she presented not as a request but as information. Arthur and Minnie had looked at each other across the dinner table, and then Arthur had said, "Webb will know about the application process," and Clara had said, "I've already written to him," and Minnie had said, "Of course you have." In the spring of 1898, Minnie found herself standing in the yard on a morning that felt like the beginning of something, a particular quality of air and light that the plains sometimes produced in late March, the smell of grass and thaw, and the specific promise that the plains had always made, and not always kept, but that she had learned over 20 years to receive without the guardedness of someone who knew it might not be kept. She was 45 years old, and the ranch was exactly what it had become, and her children were exactly who they were, and the man she had married was inside at the table with the morning coffee and the newspaper from Caldwell that arrived 3 days late, and that he read from front to back with the same thoroughness he read everything. She called in to him through the open door, "Come outside." He came. He stood next to her in the yard and looked at the March morning. Harlan the cattle dog was at his feet, which was where the dog usually was. "What are we looking at?" Arthur said. "The morning," she said. He looked at it. He was 52, and time had done to him what it does, but the things it had done were not the diminishing kind. He was more himself at 52 than he had been at 32, the way certain materials become more themselves under sustained pressure. He stood next to her with his coffee and the newspaper folded under his arm and looked at the March morning with her, and Harlan sat between their feet and looked at it too. "I was thinking," Minnie said, "about October 1878. He was quiet for a moment. "What about it?" "I was thinking about opening the door," she said, "at the Waystation." "What about it?" he said again, but his voice had a different quality now. "I was thinking," she said, "that it was the best thing I ever did. The whole of what came after, every piece of it, starting with the coffee." He turned his head and looked at her. His gray eyes in the March morning were the same gray eyes that had looked at her across the table at 11 o'clock at night in 1878, but everything behind them was different. Everything behind them was this, the full accumulated weight of everything they had built and learned and lost and found and built again. "The ribs," he said. "You wrapped my ribs." "I did," she said. That's when I knew, he said, she looked at him, that you were in love with me. That you were someone worth being in love with, he said. The way you asked, not whether I needed help, just whether I needed them wrapped, like it was the obvious next thing. She turned back to the morning. It was the obvious next thing. Most people would have offered sympathy first, he said. Sympathy wouldn't have held your ribs together, she said. He made the sound that was his laugh, the fully real version, and it went out into the March morning, and the dog looked up briefly and then went back to looking at the grass. They stood there for a long time, which they had always been able to do, stand in silence together without anything being unfinished about it. The plains ran out in every direction under the enormous sky, and the cattle were in the east pasture, and James was in the barn starting the morning work, and Clara was probably already at her desk with her books, and Harlan, the cattle dog, had his nose into the spring grass at their feet. Minnie reached over and took Arthur's hand. He folded his fingers around hers with the ease of 20 years of this same gesture, and they stood in the morning and looked at the life they had made from a catastrophe, from a flood and a lost herd, and a woman with nowhere to go and a man who had arrived at her door with nothing left but his basic honesty and his manners and his hat in his hands. It had been enough. It had been more than enough. It had been, in fact, exactly sufficient to produce this March morning, this yard, this hand in this hand, this ranch, these children, this life that was real and solid and theirs. The Kansas plains stretched on to the horizon in every direction. The sky was enormous and pale blue, and full of every kind of weather, every kind of promise, every kind of difficulty and beauty that the West had always offered to the people willing to receive it on its own terms. Minnie Wells, who had been Minnie Chandler, who had stood at the door of a Waystation in October 1878 and offered coffee and honesty and the specific mercy of meeting a ruined man without pity or judgment, breathed in the March air and held her husband's hand and was entirely, unguardedly, in the truest possible sense, at home.